We're joined now by Dr. Jill K. Corbin, who is Director of College and Transition Counseling at Denver Academy, a Colorado coeducational independent day school serving diverse learners in grades 1 through 12. And also Dr. Wanda M. Hadley, who is an Associate Professor of Higher Education Leadership, Educational Leadership, Research and Technology at Western Michigan University. And then there's Josephine Vonarburg, who is an independent educational consultant and owner of Transitions College Advising, consulting company that specializes in helping students with learning differences plan and execute a successful transition to college. And last but not least, Alexander Morris Wood is Dean of Admissions, Transition Programs, and Strategic Outreach at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida, which specializes in educating students with learning differences. The first question goes to Jill. When it comes to students with learning disabilities transitioning to college, who are the ones who are typically most successful after high school?
Well, in my experience, I would say that students who tend to be more successful in the transition from high school to college are those students who can effectively self-advocate, those who truly understand what their disability is and how it might impact their learning, and then also those students who are able to effectively communicate to people within the campus community for any additional supports or assistance. So if the student feels comfortable seeking out the Office of Disability Services, connecting with their professors during office hours, or even taking advantage of any of the peer tutoring services or the writing centers on campus, these are the students who tend to matriculate, retain, and they are successful in their college career.
Thank you, Jill. Any of our other experts care to chime in?
Having worked with that student population in the college environment, written about them, I've completed a lot of research about them in terms of my research agenda. I support what Jill says. What students often don't understand when they get to the college campus is they need to advocate for themselves. In K through 12, the school system normally moves them along and does a lot of the advocating for them. Once they move to college, it's their responsibility to do that. And students that have not been a part of a strong transition plan or who haven't really thought that through tend to be the ones that don't understand that. And they sometimes live in hiding and they don't advocate to the Office for Students with Disabilities because it's not the university's responsibility. And actually it's kind of a private issue until the student actually speaks up and asks for services or support.
Thank you very much, Wanda. Our next question is to Josephine. This is a basic but overlooked point. How important is it to be sure that attending college is the student's choice, not the parent's pre-birth conception of how their child's life will unfold?
It's extremely important. College is hard, and the students need to know that. And to have the sustained effort and motivation they need to succeed, they need to be in the right place for them. And a guiding principle of all independent consultants is that we find the right fit for the student, the right college, at the right size, with the right major, with the right support. But if the parent is leading the process, we're always concerned, and we have to discuss that if it's really the student's choice to want to be in college. It's not the next step for everyone at that point of their lives. So we can look at other options or consider a gap year, but the student has to be the one to lead that particular discussion and process.
Thank you, Josephine.
Just to echo, I think what's so important is that if the student is not in the driver's seat, then they're probably not going to do that self-advocacy work that they were talking about earlier, because parents cannot email the professors or check in on tutoring or contact disability resources. So the student really needs to be in the driver's seat around their decision to enter college, to enter support programs, or to engage with resources on a college campus.
Thank you, Alex. So this next question is to Wanda. As students with learning differences reach the Bell Lap in high school, should they do some soul searching, asking telling questions such as, do I really want to go to college and work harder than ever before?
Yes, and I think that's where the strong transition planning comes in at the high school level. Treating the student like any other student going off to college, exposing them to college classes, exposing them to the college environment, exposing them to various college settings is really important too. Trying to help them to understand that the disability doesn't go away when they move on to college, and sometimes students feel that way. And when they move on to college, again, they move almost from a passive student model to an active student model, like what Alex was talking about in terms of having to speak up and identify themselves and ask for services. So the more they can understand what they're stepping into when they move to the college environment, the better I think they will be in the environment.
Thank you. Anyone else on this one?
Well, Wanda, I think what you said is so key around the transition plan. I think so often we look at self-exploration as part of the post-secondary process, when in reality that should really be part of that IEP transition plan or an early intervention plan starting as young as freshman, sophomore year of high school. So it should go in congruent with the application process, with the college search process. It needs to be part of that elongated transition plan.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. Actually, the next question is to you. Alex, how does the student knowing fully about their learning disability play into their potential college success?
I think you started, Daryl, with a really good part, is they need to be really aware of their learning disability. When we look at probably the number one factor that inhibits a student's ability to seek out services, to me, it always comes down to self-awareness. Are they really aware of their strengths and weaknesses? Do they know the accommodations and modifications that they've received in high school? How often do they have to self-advocate? What accommodations carry over to high school and college? I think once you develop that real true sense of awareness of your needs and your prior services, then you could really start to critically evaluate your next placement. If you're not aware of your program prior to college, making that jump to college is going to be really tricky because you're not going to really know what to look out for, what to assess for, and how to determine a really strong post-secondary fit.
Thank you, Alex. Any other thoughts?
And to support what Alex is saying is, some universities even have, we're preparing students to move on to the workplace. And some universities even have strong compensatory programming in the college environment, meaning that they bring the students in at a certain continuum and move them along the line where they're becoming more and more independent. Because as I mentioned earlier, the disability doesn't go away. And we want the students to be able to survive and thrive in the workplace. And there's very little even transition support in the workplace in most environments. And I've done longitudinal studies with groups of students with disabilities, moving them from high school to the college environment and to the work environment. And students have found that they're even more isolated sometimes in the work environment, and having to speak up more and understand more about their disability, and how if they don't feel comfortable doing that, it could jeopardize some movement in the workplace. So basically understanding that disability and how it influences their performance is really key early on, if you will.
I think it also comes down to, what does the parent know about the disability, and how does the parent understand what that disability is, or how it could impact how the student performs within the classroom, as well as outside of the classroom. A lot of times when I meet with parents and I explain the process of seeking out accommodations in college, to kind of support the points that we've talked about earlier, this is a conversation that the student has to have. The parents can always, as we know, the parent can be in the room, but from K through 12, the parent has been the one who is actively fighting for their child's rights within the K through 12 system. Now there's a shift in responsibility. There's a shift almost in who is leading the conversation, and it falls onto that high school student. And if the parent has taken an active role in perhaps protecting the student from what that disability is, or how it might determine their academic success, that leaves the student with an even bigger fight to fight, because one, they don't know what that disability, even the name of it. I've had some families who have kept it from their child until senior year, and that is something where then the student is just struggling to identify who they are, identify the disability, be able to really put the words into their mouth to say, hey, this is how I learn, this is how this is impacting me. So if the student isn't aware from the beginning of the situation or how it might impact their ability to grasp what's taking place in the classroom, they're going to have a harder time later on with seeking out those accommodations. So I would say that not only is it important for the student to understand what the disability is, but also the parent has to understand the disability as well.
Thank you for that additional insight, Jill.
And to kind of dovetail on that, in the higher ed environment, parents, because of FERPA, aren't always a part of the conversation. And so it is important for students to understand that maybe parents have led the way up until college, and now it really is kind of the baton is passed on to them, and they have to be much more active and involved in terms of their learning disability and their education.
I agree with what everybody says. Great points. I want to jump on what Jill said about them knowing about their disability and how it affects their learning in college. And another huge difference between high school and college is how much time students spend outside of class that they have to figure out how to use effectively to learn to be successful in class. And being a metacognitive learner is essential in college. And you can't do that without being aware of your learning strengths, your weaknesses, and what strategies work best for you. So the self-awareness also leads to being a better student, a better learner, being better able to make learning choices, study choices, and choosing the right strategies.
Thank you for that. And I'm actually coming back to you, Josephine, with this question, playing off of the self-awareness. Should students who learn differently, who were average high school students, consider a gap year or some other option to help bolster their skills and to improve their chances of collegiate success?
Yes, I think that the gap year is becoming a more popular option, especially since COVID, for all of our students, not just the ones with learning differences. We're beginning to see that society has decided that at 18 years old, right after 4 years of college, the next logical step is right after 4 years of high school, the next logical step is 4 years of college. And that's not the best path for everybody. We also have to remember that students with some learning differences can have a delay in maturation, brain maturation. So that extra year, maybe even 2 years of growth can be extremely beneficial to students. And colleges are seeing this too. They're saying that for students who take a productive and well planned out gap year, they're seeing higher GPAs, higher retention, and more persistence. So a gap year is not a year off. That's the first thing I tell parents and students. I recommend it in many cases, but I start by saying it's not a year off where you don't do anything. A gap year is something that is well planned, well structured, and is thought out to help the student develop a number of skills. It can be to better understand what their interests are and potentially find a major. You can get a part-time job, volunteer. A gap year can include taking a couple of classes at the local community college and better understanding what college level classes look like, while at the same time living at home and continuing to develop the living skills that they'll need to eventually live independently in college. And then there are also gap year programs that are specifically designed for students with learning differences that help them develop independent living skills or social skills or even college readiness skills. So there are several options, and I think it's a good idea for a large population of our students.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think with that, Josephine, you talked about such a great point, which is there's so many options out there now for gap year programs. And I think it's really important to do pre-assessment work on what are the specific skills that might impede on college success. And using that assessment to guide your plan after high school, whether it's a gap year or a couple years, is really important, because I've seen a lot of families choose programs or choose no program sometimes, unfortunately, and not really have targeted skills that you're working on. So really working with your school prior to graduation on the specific skill areas, whether it is academic-based, social, emotional, independent living, self-awareness, and choosing programs that match that skill deficit can make gap years a little more purposeful and planned. And it's also important to know that you have to have a plan after a gap year. So working with your high school to figure out where are you going after that year or two so that you're not in a reactive planning state could be really beneficial for students and families.
Thank you, Alex. Wanda, can you tell me what are some common red flags that suggest that LD students aren't ready for the demands of college yet?
I think the typical things you would see with non-students with disabilities, and that would be maybe not able to hold a job, not showing interest in college and what specific colleges they want to attend, not understanding what their, kind of like we talked about earlier, what their disability, how it influences their learning and their performance and their academics, not maybe interested in visiting universities and understanding what they look like and what can happen on college campuses. Just that kind of inquiry that we would expect of any student prepared to go off to college.
All right. Well, Jill, on the flip side, what are some signs that suggest that LD students are ready to manage the college rigor?
Sure. I would say I really liked what Wanda said about actually getting out onto other college campuses. So again, showing that initiation, that motivation, the excitement of the college search, that can be a good indicator for students who really are ready for that next step. That also kind of trickles down into the actual classroom. So if the student is engaging in classroom discussions, one thing that really sticks out to me is when a student can effectively articulate the difference with technology between it being a tool and a toy. So if the student really doesn't know how to find that boundary or that fine line between when to appropriately use technology, that can be a big indicator that the student is or is not ready for college success. I would say that I absolutely agree with students who are able to hold a job, who are engaging in community service, who are active in clubs, those who are connecting with their teachers, and who can effectively and appropriately self-advocate. And I know it can be easy for us to just kind of throw around this term of self-advocacy. So it does take some time for a student to understand what self-advocacy is and how to appropriately ask for maybe an extension on an assignment. But if the student is able to wake up for school on time, if they can get to school on time, if they have packed their lunch, if they're turning in homework, if they are involved in activities outside of the classroom, all of those are indicators that a student can be successful in college.
All right, well, thank you, Jill.
To add to that, one of the things I see students really struggle with when they move from high school to college is accommodations. It's just not common in the college environment to have the level and the extensive accommodations that are offered in K through 12. And so if in high school students are feeling more comfortable, being a little bit more independent in terms of their learning, not turning to tutoring or other kind of support as much, really willing to kind of take some more steps to be more independent, that's always a good sign that they're ready. Because as I said earlier, over and over again, students, even when they don't necessarily need them, they sometimes want to hold on to accommodations in the college environment just as their safety net. And when I talked about that compensatory kind of model earlier, we're talking about, again, moving students away, getting them prepared for the workplace, because they're not going to have extra time for an assignment in the workplace. They're not going to have a tutor to help them to complete a writing project. So we really want them to be comfortable moving on to that next level of education and work experience.
So this question is for you, Josephine. For parents of students who learn differently, who are on track to graduate in spring 2022, what are some things that they can do in the short time remaining to equip their students to be successful in college?
Thank you for the question. I think there are a couple of things that we can start doing right now to make sure their students transition more effectively to college. One of them is to better understand how the laws will change, how accommodations will change, and to make sure they're prepared for that difference. Another thing we work on is helping the student articulate his or her needs more effectively, to show me that they have awareness of their disability, not just the diagnosis, but how it affects their learning, because that's what they're going to have to do to access accommodations when they get into college. And the third thing parents can start doing is stepping away from doing too much of the daily living skill functions for their children. For example, are they waking them up every morning, and to stop doing that gradually. Another thing is if they're turning off their internet at night, to make sure they're not doing too much with that. That won't be available in college, so stepping away from that as well, and just giving the student a little bit more independence. The one last thing they can start doing is helping them better plan their own homework and learning tasks. So instead of telling them what to do when they have a test to study for, when they have homework, to ask them what's their plan and how they plan to approach any study or test preparation. So giving the student more of a lead in those tasks as well. And parents can start breaking away from them slowly and gradually until by the end of senior year, the student is more independent in these choices.
Thank you, Josephine.
And I think too, the whole notion of college choice really factors into this particular question, because universities vary in terms of their continuum of services. And so community colleges and state schools tend to have more resources available for students that are coming into the university that may need some support or assistance. Private schools tend to not have as much and may not offer as much to the student. And the buzzword on the college campus is what's considered reasonable accommodation, and the university gets to decide what's reasonable. So if a student comes in and they need X, Y, and Z, and the university doesn't offer that, they get to decide that that's not reasonable. So I think making that choice, it really is a good match for them, is really important for the student to be much more methodical in their thinking in terms of what school is a good match for them.
All right, thank you, Wanda. And the last question today is for the entire panel. We've been talking a little bit about the gap year, which I guess for some parents, after 4 years of high school, coming to realize that your student needs additional seasoning time might seem a disappointment. My question is, number one, should they consider it a disappointment? And then number two, what are some things that parents should be working on during that gap year to make sure that their kids can succeed in college when they do finally enroll?
Daryl, I think going back to what Josephine said, the skill development should be pretty similar no matter where you're going next. Really working on active awareness, understanding your current programming, independent living skills. It's really the same process. I think so often with students who learn differently, people start to look at the college transition a little later in the student's high school trajectory, which prevents their growth. And with COVID, obviously, it's been even more disrupted. So I think doing very similar skill development, getting them involved in their IEP process, having them sit with instructors to get realistic feedback, understanding their accommodations and modifications, because no matter where they go, whether it's a community college or a four-year college, they will have to go through that same process. So ensuring that kind of that skill development is looking pretty similar, because our students are typically more resilient. So pushing them throughout their junior and senior year might lead to new possibilities that you didn't think were really available once you started with that intervention.
Thank you, Alex.
And I'd like to add to what Alex said, that's so important, this idea that our students are more resilient than we think they are. In addition, they keep growing. The person that they were at the beginning of freshman year of high school is not who they are at the beginning of senior year of high school, at the beginning of freshman year of college. They keep growing, and a gap year can allow additional growth to make sure that they catch up to what their specific needs are once they get to college. I think it's a great option and should be investigated by families. And now that it's become more popular, I think it's something that families can look at as more of a norm. And I'm hoping that becomes the case as the years move on.
And I would hope they'd use that gap year to be more informed, just to make sure they're being more thoughtful and mindful about what university they would want to attend, what that university offers, think about their major, just getting more prepared, if you will, and getting, maybe a head start in some ways on the back end. So yeah, I'd really encourage that, using that time to figure out what would be the next step for you, what college, and what would be a good match, and why.
Final word to you, Jill.
Yes. So I would just say that too often I think parents look at a gap year as a potential negative, that maybe that time after high school won't have there won't be an intentional experience. So when I work with families who have a senior that is exploring the idea of a gap year, if we go ahead and look at college options and go through the process of applying, maybe even to the point of where the student is accepted and then they elect to defer for a year, I like to kind of use that following August, if you will, as their kind of end point. So then we have from after graduation high school into perhaps that first semester of college, we have maybe around 15 months. So how can we make that gap year experience, or those 15 months, an intentional and productive experience for the student? So then kind of working with the family to develop a contract, an accountability contract, if you will, so that the student has specific goals in place. And maybe that is kind of combining a couple of different options. So perhaps the student is taking some classes at a community college, as we've mentioned. Perhaps it's an actual structured gap year program, or if it's getting a job, if it's finding an internship. So again, kind of taking this opportunity to really carve out time to work on these skills, so that when the next fall rolls around and the student has deferred and is already accepted to perhaps that school that is the right fit, they are that much more advanced or that much more ready to kind of dive into the academic environment. I think we can all attest that college is hard for everyone, no matter who is transitioning from high school to college. It's tough. So if your student knows how to do the laundry, if they know when to take a shower, if they know how to pack their lunch, if they can get up on time, these are all, they feel like small tasks right now. But if the student masters these ahead of actually entering college, then they have less to sort of combat once they are there that freshman year. So I think that using that time doesn't have to be looked on as negative, maybe a waste of time. It's really just an opportunity for the student to kind of develop and hone those independent living skills a little bit more effectively.
All right. Well, Dr. Jill K. Corbin, Denver Academy, Dr. Wanda M. Hadley of Western Michigan University, Josephine Vonarburg of Transitions College Advising, and Alexander Morris Wood of Beacon College. Thanks for the knowledge.